Hello and welcome to this webinar. My name is Katrina Leclerc. I am calling in today from Treaty 1 territory out in our beautiful prairies in the center and the heart of Canada. I am serving currently as the chair of the Women, Peace and Security Network, and I'm very, very pleased to be able to welcome each and every one of you, including our wonderful experts from across civil society, research, academia, and the policy space, who will be sharing with you different components of their work and how they contextualize women, peace, and security within a Canadian context or as Canadians. I am incredibly grateful to the Research Network on Women, Peace and Security and its co-directors who have been willing and increasingly keen to collaborate with our civil society network on women, peace and security over the past few years. And this is a result of that collaboration for today's ongoing conversation on how women, peace and security applies here in Canada. I would like to note that today's conversation will be entirely in English. Si vous préférez interagir sur la question femmes, paix et sécurité en français, on vous encourage à vous joindre à nous demain pour notre webinaire qui se déroulera entièrement en français avec des panélistes francophones à travers la francophonie canadienne. Et ce sera demain, le 25 mars, encore de 13h à 14h, heure de l'Est. So today's conversation has closed captions enabled for our community who wishes to use that function, and is being recorded and will be made available on the Women, Peace and Security website. We have also enabled the question and answer function and really encourage you to use it throughout the webinar. You can, of course, use the chat as well. There will not be a dedicated Q&A section of today's conversation, but we will be taking the questions from the Q&A to integrate them into our panel discussion. And now, without further ado, I am very pleased to turn it over to one of our colleagues, Rebecca Thiessen, who is a professor at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa and co-director of the Research Network on Women, Peace and Security. Over to you, Rebecca.
Great, thank you. Yes, and welcome on behalf of the Research Network in Women, Peace and Security. My name is Rebecca Thiessen, and I'm a co-director along with Megan McKenzie, who you get to hear from today on this panel, and also Dr. Yolande Bucca, who is currently in South Africa as visiting professor. I'm delighted to be part of this webinar, at least as a listener, and to introduce our moderator and webinar organizers. First, I just want to say a little bit about the network. So the Research Network on Women, Peace and Security, for those who may not know, mobilizes international and Canadian-based expertise on issues related to women, peace and security, and more broadly, the intersections of militarism, insecurity, settler colonialism, gender, race, sexuality, age, and ability. We facilitate knowledge exchange and research dissemination among scholars, policymakers, civil society, and general public audiences. Our network is working to transform the WPS agenda by advancing a critical and intersectional feminist approach to peace and security. We have a newsletter, and you can subscribe on the RNWPS website if you're interested. You can follow us on LinkedIn and other social media. Also, if you want to take part in some of our many events that are all free. So I'm delighted to have this opportunity to join you today, and I'll turn it now back over to Katrina, who is the chair of the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada, who has been just a great asset and contributor to our discussions and a wonderful colleague through all of this.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And what better way to continue our collaborations than to be able to offer a public webinar where we can discuss how we contextualize in different ways the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And before we jump into the meat of the conversation, I want to give a small overview, a short overview of what Women, Peace and Security is for those of us, or for those who are listening and tuning in, perhaps for the first time into the community, and who have not yet experienced the wonders of trying to explore what these dynamics look like. So Monique, if we could screen share the slides. So one of the things we have to understand about Women, Peace and Security is that it did not fall from the sky, of course. So Women, Peace and Security is a policy framework that comes as an adopted framework of the UN Security Council. But before the Women, Peace and Security agenda was recognized formally by the Security Council of the United Nations, it had to undergo multiple different iterations of activism by primarily women activists who were from conflict-affected states or had experienced different types of violences, and were coming together at different critical historical moments. And one of the critical moments I want to flag, and here you see on the slide a few different key moments in the history of international women's rights, is the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which is an outcome of the Fourth World Conference on Women, which happened in Beijing, China in 1995, which was seen as a catalytic moment. One of these moments in history where we cannot separate the results or the outcome of a conference with what has happened next over the 30 years that came. So what happened in Beijing was really a catalytic moment, as I've said. It was a moment in time where women were gathering in the thousands for this World Conference, in addition to the member states of the government representatives who came to China to discuss the question of the status of women. And in addition to this platform for action, this declaration about this common language that governments were agreeing on in terms of women's rights and what they wanted to commit to doing to achieving gender equality and the rights of women across the world, a lot of the activism starting to percolate and starting to look at how some of the injustices women and young women and girls were experiencing around the world were actually issues related to human security and to more traditional forms of security. One of the things I want to flag here, and we can maybe pass on to the next slide as I'm saying this, Monique, is that what happened around this activism in 1995 in Beijing also led to the eventual activism that was organizing and critical and transformative, led primarily by women from conflict-affected states, so primarily those who were not in the usual spaces of power, the usual decision-making tables, but who nonetheless took both to the streets and to policy and arenas the conversations about the rights of women, and that included at the Security Council. And it took 5 years of coordinated advocacy between the 1995 conference and October of 2000 for the Security Council to actually shift, to a certain extent, not entirely, but to a certain extent, its thinking in terms of what actually was considered security and what was a peace and security matter. Because as we know, under Article 25 of the UN Charter, the Security Council is constituted to and mandated to maintain international peace and security. And Article 25 tells us that any government who sits on the Security Council or does not at the time a decision is made should still implement and be responsible to implement the resolutions that come, the decisions of the Security Council. So in 2000, when the country of Bangladesh in March of 2000 announced through Ambassador Chowdhury that women would be on the thematic agenda of the United Nations, and later negotiations led to under Namibia's presidency in October, led to the resolution, which we now call Women, Peace and Security, the 1325, which is the 1325th resolution. We saw a lot of pushback, a lot of organizing against what women's movements were pushing for the recognition of women's roles in both decision-making processes, but also the responsibilities that governments, states had towards and vis-a-vis women. So to make a long history short, 1325 was introduced and adopted unanimously at the Security Council after a lot of activism from women across the world, but primarily in the global south, and introduced 4 main pillars: the pillar of participation, prevention, protection, and relief and recovery. And each of these pillars touch on different components of responsibilities, but also recognition of the roles women play in different facets of peace and security, whether that be pre-conflict, during conflict, post-conflict, and in ongoing, what we would consider peaceful times. But some would, of course, argue that peace is a state that is aspirational and not any government has ever achieved it within a nation. So we've listed here the different resolutions that make up what we call the thematic agenda of the Security Council, which is why we call it the Agenda of Women, Peace, and Security, which has 11 different resolutions that touch on different aspects that complement each other and add onto the family of resolutions that make up the framework of women, peace, and security. I'm sure our panelists will speak very well about the different pillars of WPS and some of these resolutions, perhaps in some of their work. So I'll leave it at that. One other thing I want to contextualize in the next slide is on national action plans. Now, this screenshot comes from the LSE and now University of Sydney mapping on women, peace, and security national action plans. But in the early days when 1325 was adopted and certain subsequent resolutions came about, many of the world's governments were questioning how they could be able to put this into practice. And so the Secretary General at the time issued a report encouraging member states, so governments, to actually develop national action plans as a policy tool to be able to contextualize the resolutions in their own federal or national governments and to put their commitments to implementing women, peace, and security into practice. Now, this is, of course, aspirational and welcomes the collaboration of women, peace, and security policymaking and the question of implementation, but it has not been without its challenges. In Canada, per se, we have had 3 national action plans. So 3 versions of our national action plan, starting in 2011 under the Stephen Harper government, which focused primarily on the idea of peacekeeping and integrating women in our defense forces, understanding peace and security as traditional paradigms of security. Well, I know that some of our panelists will talk more about this in greater detail, and so I will leave that there. But in terms of the second National Action Plan, which was welcomed in November of 2017, we saw a greater integration of civil society efforts and mobilization within our own network, the Women, Peace, and Security Network, but also within the overall space in Canada. What that means is that the second National Action Plan in Canada that was adopted in 2017, which was for a 5-year period, looked at more of a diverse range of understandings of how we contextualize women, peace, and security, whether that means investing in peace-building efforts abroad, whether that means addressing the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis to the extent that the government has, or whether that looks at the internal workings of the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces and questions of sexual misconduct towards military personnel and our soldiers. And so the variety of themes that's starting to emerge also had us question in those years how we could domesticate, bring a domestic lens to women, peace, and security, because for a while and for quite some time, Canada would interpret women, peace, and security as an obligation in its foreign policy. So if we look at the next slide, which is very briefly an analysis of our third National Action Plan, which is 2023 to 2029, which came out in March of 2024, it demonstrates a new understanding, or what we hope is a new way of seeing women, peace, and security from our government's perspective. One of the key things that is important to understand in the history of the National Action Plans and the different iterations that came about is that our government in the second plan and now in the third plan has started to understand this cross-sectorial importance of women, peace, and security. What I mean by that is that under the second National Action Plan, which, if I'm not mistaken, may be the first country to do this, our government Department of Global Affairs Canada reached out to different departments and got the different ministries to sign on and develop different department plans to contextualize the National Action Plan even further into their own mandates. And this is done specifically under CNAP 3, so our National Action Plan's third generation, where we have 10 different government departments, ranging from, of course, Global Affairs Canada, which is the primary penholder of the National Action Plan, to the Department of National Defense, to our different Indigenous Services and Indigenous and Crown Relations Department, to our Department of Veterans Affairs, and to a variety of other departments that look at public safety and the realities of cultural nuances and dynamics that continue to be experienced differently by women, young women and girls in Canada who have different intersectional parts of their identities. And so being of one gender is not the only way that they experience the world. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass it directly to our moderator for the panel, because you came here to hear our wonderful panelists and the exceptional work that they're doing on how they're applying women, peace, and security to their work, either within our boundaries of our border or internationally. And so I'm very pleased to invite and welcome my fellow steering committee member, Denise Ko. Dr. Denise Ko is a public and occupational health specialist based in Manitoba, just a few minutes away from where I am currently located, with decades of experience in community advocacy, organizational leadership, and strategic communications. She currently serves as the WPS Committee Chair of the Manitoba Branch and the Manitoba Branch President of the Federation of Medical Women of Canada. So I'm really excited to hear Denise and our wonderful panelists, and I'm passing it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Katrina, and also for you, Katrina and Rebecca, for your opening insights. I just saw that some people are having issues with audio. I can hear the other panelists, but I see three people. Oh no. Okay, I had to re-log in. So I hope people can hear okay. Anyone from the audience that can't hear might have to re-log in, looks like. Okay, so we'll now move into the panel discussion, bringing together perspectives across research, civil society, and policy. I'll briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll move into our first question. And I'll invite everyone to keep responses to about 3 minutes so we can hear from all speakers and allow time for discussion. So first we have Wasma Froh, a human rights lawyer and peace-building practitioner with over 25 years of experience advancing gender equality and women's inclusion in peace processes, particularly in Afghanistan and globally. Next we have Wasma Froh. Next we have Megan McKenzie, and you might want to put your videos on when you can. Okay, perfect. Next, we have Megan McKenzie, Director of the School for International Studies at SFU, and a leading expert on gender, war, and military culture, with extensive research on military sexual violence and institutional inequality. We're also joined by Christine Beckgard, a PhD student at the London School of Economics, whose research focuses on technology-facilitated gender-based violence in conflict settings and its implications for women's participation in peace processes. And finally, we have Brenda Fabiani Lucchini, an international relations researcher focusing on women, peace, and security in Brazil, with a particular interest in cybersecurity and technology-facilitated gender-based violence. So I'll start with our first question. How does the Women, Peace, and Security agenda connect to your own work, and how did you first engage with it? So Wasma, I'll invite you to begin.
Thank you so much, Denise, and it's a delight to be here. And hello to everyone who's joining us. So for me, actually, it started from completely the other end of the spectrum. I started from the communities. 25 years ago, I was working with refugee camps in Pakistan and with Afghan refugees. And there I realized that this is called a humanitarian project. But what I see that it's the women who are trying to do everything to keep the peace in the camp. They are trying to resolve the disputes that's happening. They are actually trying to educate their sons and daughters in whatever means they can. They were even trying to actually prevent their children from becoming, from engaging into extremism, because religious extremism is a major issue in that part of the world. So and of course trying to bring food on the table so the men and the family does not engage in the war. And all of that was very, very much eye-opening for me, because this was not just a humanitarian lens. This was women building peace. And then on the other hand, when I returned to Afghanistan and we started the constitution building process and the government building process, I realized that women are not in the discussions, because what we have been building at the community levels, which are these informal structures, mediations, tracks, networks of women supporting the communities. All of this is missing from the major conversations. And that brought me to the public, policy connection that, what? It's the women are not participants, they are actually actors, and addressing local conflicts and addressing, extremism that's growing among the younger people and resolving the disputes. For example, we have a tradition where elder women end animosity between tribes by just bringing women from both tribes together and intervening and going to the house of the one of the a community that has started the dispute. And that's how, I worked and I started this organization called Women in Peace Studies in Afghanistan in 2010, bringing those local perspective of women and community peace into the policy level. And that's how we started peace negotiations. I believe my 2 minutes are over, so I'll stop here.
You actually have about half a minute.
Okay, so the other part of what I want to actually emphasize on why that connection or collaboration between what happens at the community and then what happens at the policy level is that this, I call women the invisible infrastructure of peace. Because what we do at the community level, and that is what lasts. The Taliban took over in 2021, in August 2021. The networks that I had worked with 10 years ago are still working right now in Afghanistan. And if time allows, then I can talk about them later.
Thanks for that. I was just about to interrupt you, but thanks also for grounding us in both the policy and lived realities of peace building. So Megan, I'll turn to you next.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the work that went into organizing this webinar. And, as the co-director of the Research Network, these are exactly the kinds of events that we want to have, where we have people from different sectors, from different, perspectives, kind of reminding us sometimes the way that we use WPS in our everyday lives can sort of seem like a bit blinding, and it's nice to hear how other people are reflecting on WPS. So this is just, I'm learning from everyone. So I'm really great, feeling grateful to participate. So for me, the Women, Peace, and Security agenda connects to my work in a very fundamental way, not only as in terms of my role as co-director, but really all of my research from my time as a PhD student even is united by a commitment to tell different stories about war in order to prevent it and ultimately to help end it. I didn't come to WPS first as a policy framework. I came to it through research that consistently pushed me to look beyond the dominant lens of men and guns. I was trained in political science and international relations, and when we learned about war, we learned about, at best, the ideas of sovereignty and borders, and maybe if we talked about people, we talked about civilian casualties. And so I was really interested and looking beyond those narratives when we were talking about conflict. So whether I was working on women in combat roles, military suicide, female soldiers in Sierra Leone, wartime sexual violence, the through line was always the same. What happens when we shift the focus to how war and militarism actually impact people, particularly women, and really anyone that are made vulnerable by these systems. And I think that shift changes everything. It changes what we see as security, what we measure, what we prioritize. So WPS for me became less of an entry point and more of a language, sort of a way of thinking about that helped me name what I was already observing. And that was that gender isn't just a side issue in peace and security. It's central to how violence is organized, how it's experienced, and often justified.
I'll just wrap up in about 30 seconds.
Yeah. Maybe I'll just talk later about some of the work that I'm doing on the first women to enter infantry roles, but basically just to say that the goal isn't just to show that women can kind of kick ass in military institutions, but to show how military institutions make women insecure. And so I can talk more about that in the next question.
Thanks so much, Megan, for bringing in that institutional and research lens. Christine, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. Obviously, also extremely delighted to be here. Good to see some familiar faces as well as some new ones. I'm part of the generation of people who was introduced to WPS by the fact that it was introduced to me in my studies. So I came across gender in the context of international security doing my undergraduate degree, and it kind of just resonated with me and I was like, these are the questions that matter. And I have been so fortunate as to make that something I pursued as an active career choice in my research and beyond in policy, kind of as an active choice. I was speaking to my friend who's a feminist historian recently, and she reminded me that that was not always the case. Feminist work, gender work has often been on the sidelines. As Wasma spoke about, is the invisible infrastructure that is so often unrecognized. So I feel very fortunate to work in this space, and I basically came across it and was like, this is what I want to work on, and made that active choice to do. I now work on technology facilitated gender-based violence and kind of came to seeing how this is an issue of peace and security, and that aligns very closely with women, peace, and security. I think so often issues of gender or issues of gender-based violence are framed as domestic issues. So we look towards domestic policies to address the ways that violence manifests for women or the ways that women are not able to participate or constrained. And obviously, those things are important, but it is also a matter of security. If we care about security, if we care about democracy, these are things that include and are fundamental to women. So for me, a lot of my research focuses on how women and gender diverse people in particular are affected by digital violence. And specifically also linking it to women, peace, and security. And it affects each of the four pillars that Katerina was talking about before. So, with regards to participation, digital tools can both increase women's abilities to participate, but can also significantly place constraints through violence. With regards to protection, again, it's a double-edged sword in terms of you can really increase women's digital literacy and enable them to protect themselves and grant them information. At the same time, they can again be exposed to lots of new types of violence and harassment. With prevention, as we see the spread of the manosphere, as we see the spread of far-right radicalism, extremism, particularly in the United States and beyond. These are questions that come into preventing violence against women, and even in questions of relief and recovery, as technology becomes more integrated in those efforts, thinking about how women specifically use digital tools in humanitarian crises and post-conflict becomes very important. So for me, women, peace, and security, as some of the others have mentioned, is not kind of something that's adjacent to my work. It is fundamental. I frankly relish being the person in traditional security spaces to ask, where are the women? How does this impact women? Are we thinking about this on the perspective of women? And I take that role very seriously. Um, and I'm very grateful to be able to ask those questions.
I'm just going to jump in there to keep us on time. So thank you for that. Yeah, I'll invite you, Brenda, to continue.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the opportunity of being here today. Actually, I came across the WPS agenda through my undergraduate studies. I started researching cybersecurity within a study group, but then I became more interested in understanding about feminist perspectives on cybersecurity, and that's how I came across the WPS agenda, especially when this framework has evolved by recognizing online gender-based violence as a matter to be integrated within WPS frameworks. And so now I currently engage with the Women, Peace and Security agenda through my current research as a visiting research student at the University of Northern British Columbia here in Canada, which focuses on the connections between WPS, cybersecurity, and online gender-based violence in Brazil. I try to understand how the WPS framework can address online violence against women in Brazil, especially due to the country's 2023 launch of its second national action plan, which recognized online gender-based violence against women as an important issue. And I try to frame this problem by three main dimensions, which is how do exactly women in Brazil experience digital violence, especially those from marginalized communities. What are the existing legal frameworks to protect them from this kind of violence? And so, how is cybersecurity policy and governance constructed in Brazil? So I think that's it.
If you had any more insights, you had a little bit more time. Do you want to
I
continue
think
on?
I'm okay.
Okay, we'll move on. Yeah, so thanks so much. We've already heard quite a rich range of entry points into WPS. So from, global peace processes to institutional analysis and emerging work in digital and cybersecurity spaces. I'm going to shift us now to the second question, and I'll reverse the order so that we can continue building on the discussion. So, question two, from your perspective, how is Canada advancing the WPS agenda in practice? Where do you see meaningful progress, and where do important gaps remain, including in areas such as gender-based violence within institutions like the military? Brenda, I'll start with you.
Okay, so I've been focusing on analyzing the Canadian 2023 NAP and in a comparison with Brazil, and especially focusing on technology facilitated gender-based violence. I saw some clearly progress in Canada's framing of technology facilitated gender-based violence, especially by integrating an intersectional approach within its current NAP, and also focusing on protect women who are who most face online violence, especially Canadian activists and peacekeepers. And I also do the connection between a comparison with Brazil's approach, who has also adopted an intersectional approach. Although Brazil has still limited development, especially within WPS implementation, budget allocation, and responsibilities between the institutions involved in WPS implementation. So I look at Canada as a kind of good study case to inform other approaches, especially in Brazil. And I think that's it.
All right, thank you, Brenda. Christine, I'll come to you next.
Yes, I think I'll speak to two main things I see in the Canadian context, kind of starting broadly and then going back to my focus on tech facilitated violence. The first is to kind of pull out something that Katerina mentioned earlier, which is Canada's inward and domestic focus on the women, peace, and security aspect. So, historically, many national action plans that are written in the global north by Western countries have an outward development security focus and are kind of doing this exportation of feminism and not really considering the ways in which gendered violence and women, peace, and security applies domestically to the many different kinds of women and people that exist within that country. So I think Canada is leading the way in a lot of ways by kind of turning that lens inward and thinking about what are the things that we need to address as a country with regards to women, peace, and security before we start to look outward. So I think that's something that sticks out to me. With regards to tech facilitated violence specifically, I recently did a large assessment of national action plans and their engagement with cybersecurity and TFGBV. Canada, I think, is one of the strongest examples of a really robust engagement for a number of reasons. The first is that it integrates across different types of policy documents. So, Canada is one of the only countries where there is explicit mention of cybersecurity not only in the National Action Plan, but that WPS is also mentioned in Canada's Cybersecurity National Action Plan. So, this means that WPS is not a siloed issue, which frequently happens, whereas it's just something that this one particular foreign Foreign Affairs Ministry works on or the Department of State looks at, and doesn't really get integrated across different types of organizations within a state. So Canada, I think, really is leading the way in terms of, again, integrating across different documents, not just within WPS. There's also a really robust engagement with the different ways that digital violence manifests in the context of women, peace, and security. So I spoke before about right-wing extremism and kind of the far-right movement and and misogyny online. This is something that's recognized in the Canadian National Action Plan. It's one of the only national action plans that I'm aware of that mentions this, but again, includes that domestic inward focus in looking at the ways that violence manifests in that context. With regards to kind of places there are opportunities to more, I think something across the board that we struggle to do within the WPS community is speak about perpetrators of violence, which frequently involves naming men as perpetrators of violence, as those who are carrying out violence against women, as those who are responsible. And I think in general, WPS national action plans can do more to engage with men and the idea of masculinity. How do we counter harmful masculinities that are being socialized online? How do we encourage men to be pro-social? How do we encourage them to be feminists? How do we show them the ways that patriarchy harms them as well? So that's something that I see in general and in Canada as an opportunity looking forward.
Great insights. Okay, Megan, I'll invite your reflections.
Thanks. I can build on Christine. I agree with what you're saying in terms of some of the strengths of Canada's approach is being willing to look domestically, and I think one of the at least places where we can mark some progress, maybe it's not where we'd want it to be, but it should be something that we see as progress is how Canada is taking serious the security and the insecurity experiences of Indigenous women. And I think this is just really a testament to the tireless advocacy of Indigenous women and their allies who have fought so hard to raise awareness around the forms of insecurity that women face, the disproportionate forms of insecurity. It's forced a broader recognition that insecurity isn't just something that happened, as Christine said, over there in conflict zones. It's happening within Canada, and that insecurity is deeply shaped by colonialism, structural inequality, and ongoing forms of violence. I think it's an important shift, and it aligns closely with the spirit of WPS when it's taken seriously. I guess, I mean, there's lots of different things that I could say in terms of what I think are the priorities or the gaps, but I guess in this current moment of global militarization, I just feel like I have to sort of say that my biggest concern, I have concerns about people feel experiencing insecurity within defense forces. That's something I've focused on for a long time. But I guess the work I'm doing right now in the DREAM Lab, which is stands for Defense Resources Exploring Alternatives to Militarism, and that's a student-focused lab, is really trying to counter this sort of bandwagoning and just wholehearted embracing of the commitment to militarizing that's happening globally, and really trying to encourage our national leaders in the Canadian Armed Forces to sort of take stock and pause before following our allies and thinking about our own priorities and values. I think there's a growing narrative that increased military spending automatically equals greater security, and also automatically sort of trickles down and towards economic fruitfulness. And research just doesn't support that. So I think these assumptions need to be challenged. And when we look at the actual threats that people in Canada face day to day, they're not military in nature. And so thinking about how Canada can really grapple and Canadians can really have tools to grapple with defense budgets and what we lose when we militarize, what we lose in terms of health spending, our ability to address the opioid crisis, our ability to address climate change, and how greatly diminished that is becoming as we sort of double down on military spending. So I think I'll just leave it there.
Awesome. So thank you, Megan. And Wasma, I'll come back to you for the final word on this question.
Thank you. I think as everybody also talked about, the war itself, the absence of war is not the presence of peace. If we have, gender-based violence, if we have bullying or levels of violence in schools, if young people are disillusioned, the mental health issues, or for example, indigenous women being murdered and missing, for example, or the level of communal violence for various reasons, or losing our opportunities to raise our voices, or the pressures to censor ourselves, all of these are early indicators of conflicts, that actually a conflict is in the making. So for that, I think in order for us in Canada to prevent all of that, it's important to see that where does that peace building infrastructure lies. One of the areas is actually the diaspora communities. They bring in the lived experiences, and they are like just bridges between, as this the number of or the composition of population is kind of changing in Canada for the past 10 years. I've seen how much, for example, immigrants, refugees, people from different parts of the world, have made Canada their homes. So for us to understand that, how do we build peace and ensure that our security is humanized? Humanizing our security actually means to understand these lived experiences and bring it into the policy level. When I talked about the women, in Afghanistan, for example, who are building those networks, I find the same actually efforts by women in the community I'm living in Ontario, for example. These are the newcomer support groups. There are community building initiatives. There are system navigators, for example, women volunteer groups, and they are all doing different bits and pieces in order to address, challenges in the community. But when I see them accessing resources and accessing policy conversation, that's missing. So we need to connect these infrastructures of peace to the policy level. Who makes the decisions on funding? For example, why informal groups of women are not getting funded? Why don't they have a say in policy making? And when CNAPs are being developed, when the military budgets are being developed, where are the voices that these communities have? So it's important to actually, for us as advocates as well, to advocate for connecting the link from here, where the community piece is, to the policy level, where the decisions are being made, and also where the money is actually being decided. So, and the last thing I also want to mention that, when we talk about collaboration, there's a lot of talks about collaboration within WPS. But imagine if you engage me in a system that I have no say about the agenda, then I'm not collaborating. I'm just, maybe information sharing or being managed to share my information. But there is nothing that I can actually own as this is something that I belong in this process. So we need to ask questions about the systems that we are all part of, that not just within the government, but even within the civil society, these hierarchies that have been created, even within the civil society, the bubbles that we have created. I think we need to be a bit critical and question them, and see that, yes, women are at risk in particularly in conflicts, but these are risk. Women are also risk mitigators and risk managers. So how does that translate into policy is, I think, very much the work of all of us together that we need to keep pushing for. Thank you.
Thanks. So we're hearing both clear areas of progress and then some important tensions, particularly around how commitments translate into practice. And also whose perspectives are centered in defining security, including within our own institutions. I think we have enough time for a question from the audience, and I saw one earlier. Okay, Beth Woroniak had mentioned here about the disillusionment globally on the lack of progress on the WPS agenda. The news is full of armed conflict and rising militarism, including military spending. And you'd be interested in hearing from the panelists on where they see actual levers for change and positive movement. we can go back to you, Wasma, and I'll try to keep it. We'll have maybe about a minute each to see if there's another question.
Sure. I think, after 25 years of WPS, there is a lot of disillusionment that we all are experiencing and a lot of frustration. So maybe it's time for us to actually start questioning this whole participation model, the whole inclusion model. We have to ask questions where inclusion gives us what we actually are looking for, or actually it's more than that, it's authority. I think the model of authority is critical for getting the voices of the people who are being impacted by militarization, who are being impacted by, for example, militarized security, and particularly when it comes to the government's spendings, for example, where the money is being kind of allocated. And that's something that I have seen in my work, for example, working with local women peace builders. None of them are participants. They are not asking to be participants. So we need to question, some of these pillars of our WPS agenda as well, that after 25 years, they are actually asking for authority, for decision making. So the reason that we are not part of the conversations is actually because we do not have an authority to be part of the decisions that are being made on our behalf. And when I see we as women groups, civil society, as well people from academia, practitioners, all of us. So we are in a bubble somewhere else. We talk to each other. There's a lot of preaching to the converted, and then there are decisions being made somewhere else that we are missing from that conversation. So I think we need to move beyond this model of participation and actually ask for authority in being part of the decision making. That is very much critical for me right now.
Thank you. So then I'll invite Megan to give her thoughts.
Yeah, Wasma, I just totally agree with everything you're saying. I think that's such a great point. I mean, one of the things I would say is I do think that feminist scholars and people who have been committed to WPS sort of feel almost gaslit in this moment. So those of us who've been talking about how gender matters and feminist analysis matters, when you have this moment where you have global leaders who are men who probably have never even felt unsafe, in their day-to-day lives. And I think this is something that we need to be more bold, or I'm trying to be more bold in talking about that. We have been working so hard to have gender be part of the discussion, and our perspective is so valuable. The wars in Iran, the war in Gaza, it's not going to end by more militarism or by men who kind of just, keep the same approach. It's going to end by diplomacy, by thinking about how these conflicts are affecting people, by looking at the broader consequences. And so I guess I do feel some optimism in the solidarity and the conversations and the anger that women have together in the way that we see this differently. And we actually have the tools to get over the real current crisis that we're in.
Christine, do you want to continue?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief and kind of again, I agree with everything that's been said so far, but when we look at what works, women work. So if you fund women's organizations, if you give them unrestricted funding, unearmarked funding, funding that is not bound to certain conditions or certain policies, women know what needs to happen in their communities in order to create change. So I think that's something that's like worth reiterating. And I think Megan mentioned that maybe some of us are, offended by the men saying this doesn't matter. I think that women working on peace and security issues would be offended by saying that WPS has failed or hasn't gone far enough because people work extremely hard. So the first thing is just women work. So funding them is the most effective thing we can do. And within that, kind of deconstructing and asking difficult questions about where is funding flowing. So I mentioned before that I've been very fortunate to make a career in this space, but why am I being paid to sit and research women, peace, and security rather than people being paid to do the work on the ground? Those are structures that are currently beyond my control, but ones that are worth having conversations about. And so I think it always comes down to funding and where we're directing it.
Great points there. Brenda, do you have any thoughts on
I
that?
also agree with the previous panelists saying, and I also understand that the growing militarization of actually it strengthen opportunities for WPS and also increase its relevance, especially when it comes to implementation. And I also share the opinion of the need to recognize small wins, even if WPS is not what we want it to be. And I also agree with Wasma about what you said about participation. And I also think it is imperative to give more attention to local feminist movements, especially in Global South, since the WPS practice has also been shaped by Global North players.
Oops. Thanks for all of that. Great, great insights there. We'll close with one final question. And this is, if we were to identify one concrete shift or action, whether at the policy, community, or institutional level, that could meaningfully advance WPS in Canada over the next few years, what would it be? Sorry, Brenda, you go ahead first.
Sorry, I missed the question. Can you repeat, please?
Basically, if you can think of one, concrete action that we could be doing within the next few years that would show tangible results, what would you recommend, or what do you think it would be?
Okay, I think Canada has made some progress in recognizing more sources of domestic insecurity, but I also think it could go even beyond than that, because sometimes, especially when looking at technology facilitated gender-based violence, they mention in their NAP about policy coherence with their national cybersecurity strategy. But then also when you look at this cybersecurity strategy, you don't see like any mention to gender. So I really see a room for progress there and also other issues.
Great, thanks. Christine, do you want to give
Yeah,
some
I'll be
thought?
brief, but I'll speak to kind of three levels of like individual Canadians, domestic policy, and international policy. I think in an individual level, and coming back to what I spoke about before, speak to the men in your life. You don't know what rooms they're in, you don't know what conversations they're having. If you're a person who has the ear of a man, speak to them about these issues and make sure they understand why they matter. Kind of at a domestic level for Canada, I think continuing to take seriously this internal look at what is going on for Indigenous women, at the ways that the far right is moving throughout Canada, and continuing to make progress on those things is the place where they can have most influence for Canadian citizens, for people who live in Canada, and can lead by example. And then finally, at an international level, in a moment where we're seeing so much backlash on gender and women, peace, and security, is taking on that mantle of being a leader. So as we see our neighbors to the south of Canada backing down from all these commitments, making sure that these voices are still heard and these issues are still brought to international tables, I think will be crucial.
Megan, do you want to continue?
I think literacy around defense budgets is actually one of the most powerful tools. I think we should be talking to students, to young students, about how to understand defense budgets, how to sort of not buy into the logic that the money we spend on defense is somehow sacred and separate from our healthcare budgets or from our budgets around climate change. They are not. $1 that goes here does not go here. And to really just gain literacy within the Canadian public to help them understand the trade-offs and help them to be advocates around whether they want warships or doctor salaries. And those are the concrete trade-offs, and to get them to see that as a voting issue, to get them to feel empowered to ask questions about defense budgets, to not see it as anti-patriotic or anti-troop, but to see it as pro-national security.
I'll give you the final word, Wasma.
Thank you. I think on immediate terms, we need our WPS ambassador position filled. We all need to actually keep asking for it, and really we need an WPS ambassador. We need funding for, gender-based violence, IPV, supporting mental health support for women in our, wage needs to actually strengthen, and the funding needs to go to more local nonprofits in Canada, but also internationally. Canada has been like it's a beautiful country in terms of when it comes to this perception that people have outside. So actually it can play a leading role in creating that feminist foreign policy, feminist international assistance policy, and translating it by supporting local groups, by supporting informal women groups, not just the UN agencies and big international organizations, but actually supporting women who build peace on the ground. And the last thing is also about getting women into positions of power. I want to see women as governors, women as mayors. I want to see women in provincial councils and regional councils and city councils, women in parliament. And that is how actually we also, if get more resources for women to run for the office and getting women into the positions of power, because I'm sure once you have women in positions of power, like leader, and women who are qualified, I think they will not bomb each other. They might actually disagree on many things, but they would not bomb each other. Thank you.
So thank you to all of our panelists for such thoughtful and grounded reflections, and to everyone who's joined us today. Lots to talk about. We've seen lots of things about where we've been very successful in Canada as a country, but then also a lot of the big things that we could be doing better. So just again, thank you to our speakers and to WPSNC and the Research Network, WPS, for convening this important conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Well done. Thank you. And thank you, Denise, for chairing the panel.